All right, peace on earth. Isn't that soothing? I wanted to talk about specifically one thing. What is sacred geometry? Mostly when I see sacred geometry explored, rather, I should say when I saw it explored before I wrote my book, The Geometry of Energy, it was all based on the flower of life and the Platonic solids and uh, and then often enough there would be some elaboration on the geo-celestial synchronicities that go into placement and so forth. Um, when I was in Sedona, Arizona, I think basically every other person that goes to Sedona goes there and meets one of their new best friends. And when I was in Sedona, I met what has now become one of my new best friends. And we were having lunch, and she was telling me about a meditation practice of hers. And I said, well, that harkens back to the four dimensions of geometry. And she said, what are you talking about? and and I, I'm really obsessed with the number four because of one of the first books I wrote, The Matrix of Four. And the four dimensions of geometry are mathematical, of course, but the way I started to look at things through the Matrix of Four was that when there was an obvious social elaboration in a context, there was perhaps a meditation built into it that was often one of these unsaid you know, things that are hard to prove even too. For instance, the allegory of the cave. There are four characters, and one of the characters is the freed prisoner, and he gets out of the cave. And so, how many caverns of consciousness can we exit from? How many times do we exit a cave during our life? How many times can we become the observer and then exit the cave and then, uh, you know, become a more and more refined observer every time we exit a cave? Uh, so this is one example of where I look to find points of correlation, points, pun intended, where uh, different abstract, but not necessarily abstract if you know about the four parts, not necessarily abstract, but just different levels of interpretation. The four parts are really kind of a secretive teaching through an ancient Hebrew dialogue and story, but boils down to this. Um, there are four ways to understand or interpret any theological teaching, and for that matter, any teaching whatsoever. There is the literal and allegorical. This, if you look at most religions, they're basically based on literal or allegorical interpretations. But there is also the comparative, and the fourth level is the secretive. So there is in the four parts this teaching that I think is one of the great examples of the Matrix of Four, sets that there are four ways of understanding biblical, religious, theological, spiritual, and really any such mythology also included in that. There's four ways to understand it: the literal, the allegorical, the comparative, and the secretive. And you're welcome, because that's a useful tool. Uh, please utilize that. And don't let anyone ever tell you that there's one way to interpret a thing. So I really like to, with that teaching in mind and several others, I like to look at when there's an obvious context. Well, what's the comparative? What's the secretive? And allegorical, of course, and not just the literal context that's being demonstrated. So she's telling me about her meditation, and I realized immediately how it drew parallel lines, another pun intended, with the four dimensions of geometry. And there is a four-dimensional geometric way to look at place and time. That's not what I'm talking about. The four dimensions of geometry are points, lines, planes, and solids. Another thing, real quick, in the matrix of four, I utilize arithmetic, not just for mathematics, right? There's another example of how tools can be used for different functions than what their seeming design illustrates, the obvious design, right? So the matrix of, the four dimensions of geometry, points, lines, planes, and solids, or volumes, were depicted in her meditation. If one had them on their mind, like I did, in the meditation they were depicted very strongly. To her, she didn't have that on her mind, so she didn't necessarily see that. I think to other people they didn't see it as well, but it's right there. So what is sacred geometry? Well, it's parallels and teachings that can be of mathematics and even understandings of appearances and relationships that can be applied in other manners, right? In other sets of systems, right? And so when I started thinking about what came to be a book, when I started thinking about the concept of the four dimensions of meditation, it became something that I thought at first would be an article, but expanded into systems that, although sometimes parallel, were entirely separate. It would seem, right? But all celebrate humanity, all are human tools, so why would they not be similar? But with the similarity aside, the fact that these teachings are sometimes subtly, sometimes not so subtly, directly related to the four dimensions of geometry. And as the way I put it in my book, The Geometry of Energy, How to Meditate, the point is symbolic for concentration. And even in Zen meditation, where it's mind of no mind, and really focusing on not having a thought, which is, of course, the pinnacle operative of that meditation, but not necessarily how one performs it. One will hardly ever have a moment of no thoughts, right? More than a moment, even, better to say. But there's some level of concentration. An example, one of the classic ways that an adolescent or an adolescent mind might think of meditation is they'll think that people sit there and chant, right? And the mantra is the point of concentration in that function. You can meditate with mantra or sound. It's obviously not needed. So the first level of meditation on a kind of daily practice as you go, and the first level of meditation just as you proceed in long-term practice is concentration. And people may say that, of course, you can't concentrate because then you're not doing it, but they're negating the fact that you have to make room to sit there and so forth. They're being witty adolescents, aren't they? So the first thing you have to do is concentrate. In Tibetan Buddhism, they refer to and this is a culture of meditation, of mantra, and of the most spiritual and esoteric practices on the planet. And they also, not only do they have a wide and diverse set of meditations, they acknowledge there are other meditations from elsewhere, their neighbors and beyond. The Tibetan Buddhists note that there's two types of meditation. The concentrate and analytical, right? Or the single pointedness and analytical, right? So in traditional practice as well, first one has to practice single pointed meditations before one can move on to analytical meditations. So single pointedness, right? Again, there's a correlation with the four dimensions of geometry in the point being symbolic for correlating with concentration. One of the main practices of mine, or main sets of practices of mine, tend to be Buddhist and Tibetan Buddhist. I empathize with them the most, besides, I guess, the Chinese practices that I do. But when I was finally researching some of the final elements of the book, and when I got the proof of oh my gosh, this is everywhere, I saw the relationship with the tarot to the four dimensions of geometry, and I'm about up. My time's about up, so please reach out to me through YouTube or Facebook or what have you. And I hope this was a little brief understanding and kind of curious, thing for you. And I'm fading out, so check out my book, The Geometry Energy and How to Meditate. It's also an exploration of understanding energy, right? Like the word geometry implies. So peace on earth, be well. My time's up.